Oh, it's great to be here with you. I love being at Faith and Freedom event. You know, Ralph keeps having me. I just told him, I hope you get to have one next year after I finish speaking. But anyway, we got a lot to talk about. And don't you love Jeff Sessions? I mean, we've been in the trenches fighting together, and I love being in the trenches fighting with him. He's a great, smart man, even though he does talk with a Southern accent. And as Jeff Foxworthy said, when people hear a Southern accent, they immediately deduct 50 IQ points from how smart they think you are. I get that. And from some of the email and nasty messages I get, I think there really is something to that. But he mentioned Justice Scalia. Aren't we grateful that God allowed Antonin Scalia to be on the Supreme Court? What a blessing he has been. And I can tell you, I counted him as a friend. Hope he felt that way. But where we are in the country right now, we didn't deserve him. He was a man of principle. But, of course, I loved both his principle, I loved his plain-spokenness, and I loved his sense of humor. And there was no better memories I've had, been some really unpleasant ones in Washington, but than to sit down at a meal with Justice Scalia and swap stories and jokes, because he loved good jokes, good stories. And I told one, and it's tough sometimes when people like jokes to find one they hadn't heard before, you know. But anyway, he says, oh, well, how about this one? This probably happened back down in Texas, but it was back when they used hanging. He said, a defendant, just the worst of the worst. He murdered. He had done the worst, most despicable things. He'd been sentenced to hang. And on that Saturday morning, they brought him out. 2,000-3,000 people gathered to see it. And the sheriff brings him up on the gallows, and he says, now, we have a tradition in our town. Before we hang somebody, we give them a chance to address the crowd. Would you like to do that? And he said, no, not really. He said, I don't think you understand. You're about to go meet the Supreme Court, the Supreme Judge, your maker. And most people think it's a good idea maybe to apologize, ask forgiveness. You got a lot of victims' families out here, people that you've harmed and murdered and done things to. Don't you feel like you'd like to apologize before you're hanged? He said, no, not really. And so at that point, somebody in the audience yelled, will the gentleman yield? And he looked at the sheriff and said, I don't know what that means. And he said, oh, the guy that yelled that, that's our local congressman. And that's Congress talk, for he wants you to give him your time to speak to the crowd. And he said, could I do that? And the sheriff said, well, yeah, I guess you could. Do you want to? He said, I sure do, on one condition. He said, what's that? That you hang me first. And so anyway, that was Justice Scalia. What a delightful man who cared deeply about the Constitution. Now, I am going to get to something right now that, and this apparently is what I'm famous for, and it drives the left nuts, but I'm going to talk about something that enough people are not talking about. And what happens when a very important issue is afoot and good people, smart people, don't talk about it, then the wrong people ways, and they do great harm to this nation and to the individuals in this nation. You've heard of something called transgender. We got to talk about it, okay? And this is not me speaking. You may have seen I brought a manila folder. I've never done that before. I always have a little card that has my little outline, and I look down and it reminds me to get back on track. Well, this time I've got articles here, and like I say, I've not done this before, but I wanted you to hear this from what one transgender man said is the leading expert, he said, in the world when he was talking to me. I think he's the best in the world, but he was the head of psychiatry at John Hopkins Medical Facility, and I vaguely remembered reading somewhere that back in the 60s, Johns Hopkins was the first hospital to start doing sex change surgeries. I've read that. Maybe you have. But I did not read anywhere until Walt Heyer directed me to Dr. McHugh's article in Wall Street Journal. They stopped doing this years ago, the sex change. And so let me tell you what Dr. Paul McHugh, he's now retired as the head of psychiatry, but he's still associated with Johns Hopkins. But these are his professional views, and I was hosting Point of View just in the last couple of weeks for Kirby Anderson, and I had Dr. McHugh on, I had Walt Heyer on. But anyway, his article, and you can find this in Wall Street Journal, May 13th, he says, policymakers and the media are doing no favors either to the public or the transgendered by treating their confusions as a right in need of defending rather than a mental disorder that deserves understanding, treatment, and prevention. This intensely felt sense of being transgendered constitutes a mental disorder in two respects. The first is that the idea of sex misalignment is simply mistaken. It does not correspond with physical reality. The second is that it can lead to grim psychological outcomes. He says the transgendered suffer a disorder of assumption like those in other disorders familiar to psychiatrists. With the transgendered, the disorder assumption is that the individual differs from what seems given in nature, namely one's maleness or femaleness. Other kinds of disordered assumptions are held by those who suffer from anorexia or bulimia nervosa, where the assumption that departs from the physical reality is the belief that the dangerously thin are overweight. So he goes on and discusses that, but then he says, for the transgendered, this argument holds that one feeling of gender is a conscious, subjective sense that being in one's mind cannot be questioned by anyone else. The individual often seeks not just society's tolerance of this personal truth, but an affirmation of it. Here rests the support for transgender equality. The demands for government payment for medical or surgical treatments and for access to all sex-based public roles and privileges. He says, with this article, advocates for the transgendered have persuaded several states, including California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, to pass laws barring psychiatrists, even with parental permission, from striving to restore the natural gender feelings to a transgender minor. The government can intrude into rights to seek help in guiding their children, indicates how powerful these advocates have become. Now, he's saying that psychiatrists must challenge this, and he makes the great point I brought up on the radio show. What an incredible irony that states have passed laws that say you can't take a child to a psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor for what is only in their head, to get them help for only what's in their head, no physical manifestation. And as he says here, disorders of consciousness, after all, represent psychiatry's domain. Declaring them off limits would eliminate the field of psychiatry. You get that? Doesn't that make sense? He says you won't hear it from those championing transgender equality, but controlled and follow-up studies reveal fundamental problems with this movement. When children who reported transgender feelings were tracked without medical or surgical treatment at both Vanderbilt University and London's Portman Clinic, 70 to 80% of them spontaneously lost those feelings. 25% did have some persistent feelings. What differentiates those individuals remains to be discerned. Holy smoke. Think of the damage that we're doing to kids. Not just the poor girls or women that have been sexually abused, having a man walk into them in their most important privacy. That's bad enough, but what about the damage to the little child that is confused, and we are not allowed to help that confused child? He points out a 2011 study at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden produced the most illuminating results yet regarding the transgender that could give advocates pause. Unfortunately, it hasn't. But he says the study, up to 30 years, followed 324 people who had sex reassignment surgery. The study revealed that beginning about 10 years after the surgery, the difficulties, most shockingly, their suicide mortality rose 20-fold above the comparable non-transgender population. This disturbing result has yet no explanation, but probably reflects the growing sense of isolation reported by the aging transgendered after surgery. The high suicide rate certainly challenges the surgery prescription. I didn't read this, but it turns out Johns Hopkins, the first hospital in America to do sex change surgery, quit doing it years ago because they found we're not helping and we're probably hurting, so we should not, as they have said, be cutting off normal organs. Folks, this is serious, and I know it's unpleasant to talk about, and that's why so often we lose. People are afraid of being called crazy or phobic of some kind. Well, y'all, I have one phobia, and that's a God phobia. I have a fear of God. And we're told that's the beginning of wisdom. And I got a long way to go, but that's the beginning. Well, he finishes his article. He says, at the heart of the problem is confusion over the nature of the transgendered. Sex change is biologically impossible. You hear that? This is what one transgender sex change surgery victim says is the guy that knows more about transgender. And he's saying sex change is biologically impossible. People who undergo reassignment surgery do not change from men to women or vice versa. Rather, they become feminized men or masculinized women, claiming that this is civil rights matter and encouraging surgical intervention is in reality to collaborate with and promote a mental disorder. Now, when I was interviewing him, I said, well, you know, the new DSM-5, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that over the years it changes and evolves, and it has what is the accepted diagnoses that a physician can prescribe or list. And they've changed this mental disorder of transgender to the term transgender dysphoria. And Dr. McHugh said on the radio with me, he said, that dysphoria may be more descriptive than disorder because dysphoria, you know what euphoria is. This is an antonym. And it means that you have a general feeling of dissatisfaction with something. In this case, being with your female or masculine gender. It's a generalized sense of dissatisfaction. And for that, you want to cut off organs and destroy people's lives? And now this administration says, we're going to have the VA do sex change operations. Really? Do we not have enough veterans committing suicide without you increasing that 20 times? Enough is enough. And we have to stand up for our veterans. We're the adults. We have to stand up for our children. And let me just give you this last final story. Sometimes people talk about, wow, even when he was a judge, he made international headlines. I had a guy come before me for stealing a car. I was a felony judge. The state legislature had just made that a mandatory probation. Well, I look at this guy's, he's got this long rap sheet, all of these convictions. I wouldn't have given him probation, but that was mandated. But I get to set the terms of condition. And I couldn't bring this up, but his lawyer brought it up first, that my client has AIDS, and so, you know, we want to make sure that if you send him to substance abuse treatment, that he gets this medication, keeps him alive. And I said, I understand the state will take care of that, but one of my jobs is to make sure with the conditions of probation that I protect the public safety. And it has occurred to me that, you know, when you go for surgery, a doctor has to, by law, give you all the risks of which they're aware of the surgery. And then once you've been informed of all the risks, you have to sign a statement of informed consent that you understand those risks and you wish to go ahead with the surgery. And otherwise, the doctor is liable to you. And I said, I got to thinking about this, and I said, I don't know where you got the HIV virus, and for our purposes, it doesn't matter. But I bet when you became HIV positive, you wished the person that gave it to you had told you about the risks inherent to having sexual relations. And so here's one of your conditions of probation. You will not have sexual relations with anyone unless you first advise them in writing that you have AIDS, that they could get it and they could die. Doesn't that sound fair? And he nodded. Yeah, that seemed fair. And everybody thought that seemed fair. And then we had all of these gay rights groups came after me, grievances filed, ACLU filed an appeal, all this stuff. It made internet news, which is how I found out about a Gohmert relative in Europe. Anyway, as they read about me in a European newspaper. But anyway, so I had judges across Texas say, wow, Louie, that was really smart. I love what you did. I said, oh, you want the forms? Are you crazy? I don't want the grief you've been getting. But anyway, that was, I believe, in 1994. Now most states have made it a crime if you have AIDS and you knowingly expose other people to that intentionally. That's a crime. But somebody had to stand up back at the beginning and be called crazy and be called a homophobe and all these other things, when all I was really doing was caring about the people that could be harmed if I didn't speak up. Folks, we've got to do the same thing. That's why you're here. That's why we've got hope, because we know the Creator and we know the source of our strength. My time is up, but your time is not. Let's stand together and make our voices heard. Thank you. God bless you.